In the year 525 before the Common Era, the Persian Empire stretched across an immense portion of the known world, and at its center stood a king who had inherited not only the throne of Cyrus the Great, but the restless ambition that came with it. His name was Cambyses. Egypt had fallen beneath Persian power after the battle at Pelusium, and the ancient kingdom of the Nile now belonged to the Achaemenid king. Yet beyond the conquered cities, beyond the temples and irrigated fields, beyond the familiar green ribbon of the Nile, there was another Egypt. An Egypt almost empty of human life, where the land seemed to dissolve into distance. To the west lay the great desert, an ocean of stone and sand stretching toward the Libyan interior. Somewhere beyond that emptiness stood the oasis of the Ammonians, the sacred place later known as Siwa, where an ancient oracle of Amun drew travelers toward a remote sanctuary surrounded by palms and water. It was there, according to the ancient historian Herodotus, that Cambyses directed a portion of his army. They were not merely soldiers marching toward another city. They were entering a landscape in which roads could vanish, landmarks could disappear, and the horizon itself could become a deception. Their destination was distant, their route uncertain, and their greatest enemy would not carry a spear. It would move silently across the ground, grain by grain. The army that began its journey had already crossed a world of astonishing scale. Persian soldiers were accustomed to long campaigns, to marching beneath the sun, to carrying weapons and supplies across conquered territories. But the desert demanded a different kind of knowledge. In the cultivated lands of Egypt, water announced itself through canals, palms, villages, and fields. In the desert, water could lie hidden beneath miles of lifeless ground, while a single wrong turn could transform a planned journey into a slow disappearance. Herodotus tells us that the force sent toward the Ammonians departed from Thebes, traveling with guides, and eventually reached a place he called Oasis, a settlement said to lie 7 days across the sand from Thebes. This detail is strangely comforting at first. 7 days. A measurable distance, a destination that could be counted toward, step by step. The soldiers would have watched the desert change around them as the last signs of ordinary Egypt disappeared. Behind them remained the Nile Valley, with its temples, animals, farmers, and ancient cities. Ahead was the immense western desert. Perhaps the men believed that the journey would be difficult, but temporary. Perhaps they imagined that beyond the next ridge there would always be another guide, another water source, another palm-covered refuge. And perhaps, somewhere in the long columns of marching men, there was already someone who understood the truth. In the desert, certainty can disappear long before the traveler does. For several days, the army continued into the silence. Imagine the slow rhythm of such a march, thousands of footsteps pressing into sand that immediately softened their marks, leather sandals and armored feet moving beneath a merciless sky, standards rising above the columns like thin fragments of civilization. The guides would have searched for familiar shapes in the land, reading the subtle language of dunes, stones, stars, and distant ridges. The soldiers themselves would have seen little that could hold their attention. There were no walls to conquer, no enemy formations appearing on the horizon, no towers announcing a city. Only space. And space in the desert has a peculiar power. It can make an army seem smaller with every mile. The men marched together, yet each individual was surrounded by an emptiness that stretched farther than the eye could measure. The ancient accounts do not tell us what every soldier thought during those days, and so the silence belongs to imagination. Perhaps some spoke quietly of Egypt. Perhaps others thought of Persia, of their families, of the great cities they had left behind. Perhaps the younger men still believed the journey would end in victory and rich rewards. Somewhere ahead, they had been told, was an oasis, and beyond it the sacred land of the Ammonians. But as the army moved farther from the Nile, the desert began to erase the familiar world behind them. Eventually, the army reached the oasis described by Herodotus, a place where water and vegetation appeared almost impossibly amid the surrounding emptiness. For the soldiers, such a place must have seemed like a temporary return to the living world. Palms would have broken the monotony of sand, and water would have transformed the meaning of every breath. But the oasis was not their destination. It was only a stopping place before the final crossing. From there, the soldiers were expected to continue toward the Ammonians. Herodotus records that after reaching the oasis, the story becomes uncertain. No reliable witness, he says, could describe what happened next. The army did not arrive at its destination, and it did not return to Egypt. The silence begins precisely where the landscape becomes most dangerous. This is what makes the story so haunting. There is no battlefield. No surviving enemy account describes a great clash. No ancient inscription proudly records the defeat of the Persian column. There is simply a point on the desert route beyond which the army seems to vanish from history. And perhaps the strangest part is that the story did not disappear with them. Generations later, travelers could still repeat the tale of an army swallowed somewhere beyond the oasis, beneath a sky that offered no shelter and a ground that could shift beneath the feet of an entire civilization. Then came the final departure. Somewhere beyond the oasis, the soldiers entered the desert once more. The columns stretched across the sand, carrying weapons, provisions, shields, clothing, and the expectations of a king who believed distant lands could be brought beneath his authority. The men had guides, but guides were not gods. A desert route could be altered by wind, weather, exhaustion, or a single mistake. Herodotus says that the army traveled from the oasis and had gone roughly halfway toward the land of the Ammonians when the disaster occurred. The soldiers had stopped for a meal. It was an ordinary human moment in an extraordinary landscape. Men lowered their burdens. Animals rested. Food was prepared. For a short time, the army ceased to be a military machine and became a gathering of tired human beings beneath the open sky. No one eating that morning could have known that later generations would remember this pause as the last moment of their existence. According to the tradition preserved by Herodotus, a powerful wind arose from the south. It did not arrive like an army. It arrived like weather, without intention, without hatred, without negotiation. The first sign may have been a distant darkening of the horizon. Then the air itself began to change. Sand lifted from the earth, and the empty landscape became a moving wall. The ancient story says that the wind became violent, carrying enormous masses of sand and burying the army until the soldiers disappeared completely. It is a sentence so simple that it almost hides the terror within it. 50,000 men, in the later retellings of the story, reduced to silence beneath a landscape that had no monuments, no graves, and no witnesses. Yet there is something important to remember before we allow the legend to become too certain. Herodotus was writing generations after Cambyses, and his account preserves what the Ammonians themselves reportedly said. Modern scholarship has questioned the literal image of an entire army being instantly buried by a sandstorm, and some researchers have proposed that the expedition may have been connected not with Siwa at all, but with political resistance in another oasis farther south and west. Archaeology has also failed to produce a confirmed mass grave or unmistakable battlefield proving the traditional story. The mystery, therefore, survives not because we know exactly what happened, but because we do not. Somewhere between history, oral memory, political conflict, and the unforgiving geography of the Sahara lies the truth. And as night eventually descended over that ancient desert, the Persian army was no longer visible. The wind passed. The dunes settled. The horizon became quiet again. But beneath those dunes, perhaps something remained. Metal, bone, fragments of cloth, or simply the memory of footsteps that had once crossed the empty land and never returned. And so, somewhere beyond the last oasis, the trail of Cambyses' lost army fades into the sand. There is no final command recorded, no final message carried back to the king, no survivor standing before the Persian court to explain where the thousands had gone. The desert simply closed over the story. Long after Cambyses was dead, long after the Persian Empire itself had changed and ancient kingdoms had passed into memory, travelers continued to cross those western sands beneath the same enormous sky. They walked among dunes that had shifted for centuries, never knowing whether the earth beneath them concealed the remains of soldiers who had marched there 2,500 years earlier. The possibility was enough to keep the legend alive. Somewhere out there, beneath layers of sand moved by countless seasons, the lost army might still be waiting. Not as an army anymore, but as scattered traces of human lives. A bronze fragment, a broken weapon, a piece of leather turned hard by time, a human bone resting where the wind had left it. Or perhaps nothing at all. Perhaps the desert had erased them completely. And as we follow their footsteps into the darkness, the greatest question is not simply how they died. It is why no one ever found them. Because if the sands truly swallowed an army, then the desert has been guarding its secret for more than 2,500 years. For a long time after the last grains of sand settled, the story of the missing army remained exactly where the desert had left it, suspended between memory and uncertainty. There was no Persian report describing the final hours of the expedition, and no returning messenger carrying the names of the dead. The great empire continued to function without them. Cambyses ruled Egypt. Court officials continued to write their records, priests continued their rituals, and caravans continued to move along the ancient routes that connected one oasis to another. Yet somewhere beyond the settled lands, an entire column of men had vanished from the map. To the people who heard the story generations later, the explanation was almost irresistible. The desert had taken them. And deserts have always encouraged such stories because they are landscapes that seem capable of concealing anything. A city can be found by following its walls. A battlefield can be marked by weapons and bones. But a desert can move its own surface. One year, a ridge may stand high against the horizon. Decades later, the same place may be flattened or buried beneath another dune. The sands are never truly still. They migrate slowly, quietly, relentlessly, covering tracks and uncovering older ones. The lost army, therefore, became more than a historical disappearance. It became a story about the enormous power of nature over human ambition, a reminder that even an empire capable of crossing continents could be reduced to silence by a landscape that possessed neither walls nor armies. Yet there was another question hidden inside the legend, one that became more troubling the longer the story was considered. Why had Cambyses sent such a force so far into the desert in the first place? The Ammonians were not a great imperial power waiting to be conquered. Their oasis was important as a religious center, but compared with Egypt itself, it was a small and distant target. To reach it, an army had to leave the dependable Nile Valley and cross hundreds of kilometers of harsh terrain. There were no obvious riches waiting at the end, no great army threatening Persian authority, and no fertile kingdom that could easily sustain an occupying force. Herodotus suggests that Cambyses wanted to attack the Ammonians after they refused his demand to acknowledge his authority. But behind that explanation lies the character of the king himself. Cambyses had inherited an empire that had expanded rapidly under Cyrus and then under his own rule. Egypt had fallen, and with Egypt came the prestige of possessing one of the oldest and most powerful civilizations on Earth. Perhaps the expedition was meant to demonstrate that there was no corner of the known world beyond Persian reach. Perhaps the oasis represented not military necessity, but royal pride. And perhaps that distinction mattered. Empires often become most vulnerable when distance turns ambition into assumption. In the Nile Valley, Cambyses commanded roads, supplies, water, and established settlements. In the desert, those advantages disappeared one by one. The farther the army traveled, the more it entered a world where the authority of a king meant almost nothing. The geography of the journey is perhaps the most important part of the mystery. Ancient travelers did not experience the desert as an empty blank space. They knew that hidden beneath its apparent emptiness was a network of routes connecting wells, springs, rocky plateaus, and oases. Experienced guides could recognize tiny changes in the color of the ground, the position of distant hills, the behavior of birds, and the patterns of wind. They could navigate by stars at night and by landmarks invisible to an outsider. But an army was not a small caravan. Tens of thousands of people required enormous quantities of water. Every animal multiplied that requirement. Camels, horses, pack animals, and soldiers could survive only if the route was carefully planned. A caravan could turn back when water ran low. A military force might not have that luxury. Once thousands of men were committed to a route, retreat itself became a logistical operation. Every decision affected everyone behind it. If the guides were wrong, the error did not remain local. It expanded with every mile. The desert could therefore defeat an army without ever attacking it. A missed well could weaken the animals. Weakened animals could slow the column. Slower movement could consume more water. Less water could produce exhaustion. Exhaustion could produce confusion. And confusion could destroy navigation. In such an environment, disaster did not need to arrive suddenly. It could begin quietly, almost invisibly, with a mistake so small that no one recognized it until it was too late. And then there is the wind. To anyone living beside the Nile, wind could be gentle, refreshing, even welcome. In the open Sahara, wind could become something entirely different. Strong winds can lift enormous quantities of loose sand and dust, reducing visibility until the landscape disappears. A person can lose sight of another person only a few steps away. Voices become difficult to understand. Direction becomes uncertain. The sun can vanish behind a brown or golden darkness, and the horizon disappears completely. For travelers carrying little more than water, food, weapons, and clothing, even a relatively short period of disorientation could be devastating. Herodotus' account describes the storm as arriving while the soldiers were eating. Whether every detail is literal is impossible to know, but the image has endured because it captures a genuine danger of desert travel. Imagine the army resting after days of marching, men removing helmets, animals lowering their heads, guards looking toward an apparently empty horizon. Then the air begins to change. The wind grows stronger. Sand strikes exposed skin like fine needles. The light turns strange. The The soldiers rise, perhaps instinctively, trying to understand what is happening. Officers shout instructions, but the wind consumes their voices. Animals become frightened. Men pull cloth across their faces. And somewhere inside that confusion, the distinction between front and rear, left and right, camp and wilderness begins to disappear. For an army, formation is strength. A storm can turn formation into isolation. Thousands of individuals suddenly fighting the same invisible enemy alone. But even if the storm did occur, the ancient account leaves us with a disturbing uncertainty. Could a single sandstorm really bury an army? The simplest answer is that the traditional version may have grown in the telling. Ancient historians relied heavily upon oral reports, and stories traveled through generations before reaching a written page. Numbers could become larger. Distances could become more dramatic. A failed expedition could become a supernatural punishment. A military disaster could become a tale in which the earth itself opened and swallowed the arrogant. The desert was a perfect setting for such a transformation because no witness was required to explain what happened afterward. If the army never returned, the storm offered a complete story. Yet there may have been a more complicated reality. Perhaps the expedition became scattered. Perhaps thirst and exhaustion killed many while survivors were unable to find the route home. Perhaps hostile groups attacked the weakened column. Perhaps the army reached a different destination than the one later historians assumed. Or perhaps the soldiers were never as numerous as later tradition claimed. Every possibility changes the shape of the mystery, but none completely removes it. The important fact remains that an expedition associated with Cambyses disappeared somewhere in the western desert, and ancient writers preserved the memory of that disappearance. The sandstorm may have been the explanation, the metaphor, or the final fragment of a much larger event whose details were already forgotten when Herodotus heard the story. Centuries passed, and the desert continued its slow work. Kingdoms rose and vanished. Greek rulers inherited Egypt. Roman roads crossed parts of North Africa. New religions, new languages, and new empires transformed the region. Yet the old story remained remarkably persistent. Somewhere in the western desert, people said, a Persian army had been lost. Eventually, the possibility of finding them became irresistible to modern explorers and archaeologists. The mystery seemed almost designed for discovery. An enormous army had vanished. If the story were true, the desert should contain evidence. And evidence in archaeology can be astonishingly small. A single arrowhead can reveal a forgotten battle. A pottery fragment can identify a culture. A piece of metal can place people on a route centuries before written records mention them. So researchers began looking at the desert not as an empty place, but as an enormous archaeological archive. Satellite imagery, aerial photography, geological surveys, and modern fieldwork could reveal ancient routes that were invisible from ground level. Dry landscapes sometimes preserve things that wetter regions destroy. Beneath the sand might survive traces of ancient camps, wells, roads, or artifacts. And with every new discovery in the Sahara came the possibility that the old legend might finally be tested. Perhaps the lost army was still there. Perhaps the desert had not erased everything. Perhaps it had only hidden the evidence deep enough that humanity had not yet learned how to see it. But the deeper investigators looked, the more complicated the mystery became. Because the question was no longer simply where the army had disappeared. It was whether we had been looking in the right desert at all. The search for Cambyses' army eventually became entangled with another possibility, one that quietly changed the entire shape of the mystery. Perhaps the lost soldiers had never been marching towards Siwa at all. Perhaps the ancient descriptions had been misunderstood, or perhaps different stories had become joined together over centuries of retelling. Herodotus himself was not standing in the desert when the army disappeared. He was recording what had been told to him, and ancient geography was rarely as precise as the maps we use today. The names of places could shift between languages, distances could be estimated rather than measured, and one oasis could be confused with another. When later readers imagined the expedition, they naturally drew a straight line from Thebes towards Siwa, creating a dramatic route across the desert. But the Sahara is not a blank page. It is a complicated landscape of rocky plateaus, depressions, ancient lake beds, dry valleys, and isolated oases. A route that looks simple on a modern map could have been impossible for a large army. Another route, perhaps following an older caravan network, might have been far more practical. This possibility led some researchers to consider the Dakhla oasis and the surrounding western desert as an alternative setting for the Persian disaster. If the expedition had traveled toward a different oasis, then the famous sandstorm story might preserve the memory of a real military catastrophe while placing it in the wrong location. The mystery, instead of becoming smaller, suddenly became larger. There was not one desert to search. There were many. Far from the famous oasis of Siwa, the Dakhla region preserves evidence that the western desert was not always as empty as it appears today. Ancient settlements existed around its springs, and travelers could move through this landscape using routes that connected one source of water to another. The desert of antiquity was therefore a world of hidden corridors. To an outsider, 200 kilometers of sand might look completely featureless. To a trained guide, the same distance could contain a sequence of recognizable landmarks, old tracks, shallow valleys, and places where water could sometimes be found beneath the surface. This distinction matters when considering a Persian army. The soldiers did not necessarily march blindly into an endless sea of dunes. They may have followed an established route known to local guides, and if so, the disappearance becomes even more unsettling. A military force traveling along a known corridor should have left traces. Camps should have been established. Animals should have died. Pottery should have been broken. Weapons could have been abandoned. Fires should have darkened the soil. Yet thousands of years can be extraordinarily effective at destroying the evidence of ordinary human movement. Wind scatters objects. Sand buries them. Later, travelers walk over them. Oases shift. Ancient camps become indistinguishable from the ground around them. The absence of obvious evidence does not necessarily mean nothing happened. Sometimes it means the evidence has become so fragmented that no single artifact can tell the story by itself. And then, in the 20th century, came reports of discoveries that seemed almost too perfect to be true. Explorers and researchers searching the Egyptian desert encountered scattered objects and unusual traces that were sometimes interpreted as possible remnants of ancient military activity. Rumors circulated about weapons, pottery, and human remains lying beneath the sand. Each report seemed to awaken the legend again. Newspapers and popular histories transformed uncertain archaeological observations into tantalizing claims that the lost army had finally been found. Yet archaeology is slower and more cautious than legend. An object found in the desert does not identify itself. A bronze weapon may belong to a soldier, a traveler, or a later inhabitant. A pottery fragment may have traveled far from the place where it was originally made. Human remains can be separated from their original context by erosion, looting, animals, or centuries of movement. Even when artifacts appear together, establishing their date and cultural origin requires careful analysis. This is where the lost army becomes frustratingly elusive. There have been discoveries in the Egyptian desert that demonstrate ancient movement, trade, and military activity, but no universally accepted archaeological discovery has conclusively identified the remains of Cambyses's missing force. The dramatic headline, "The Lost Army Found," is much easier to produce than the archaeological proof required to support it. The desert keeps offering clues, but clues are not the same as answers. There is another reason the story refuses to settle. Cambyses himself was already surrounded by controversy. Ancient writers portrayed him in dramatically different ways, sometimes as cruel, unstable, sacrilegious, or reckless. Modern historians have learned to treat those descriptions carefully. They were written within traditions shaped by politics, cultural hostility, and later interpretations of Persian rule. The image of Cambyses as a mad king sending 50,000 men into the desert because of wounded pride may therefore tell us as much about ancient storytelling as it does about the historical king. Yet his decision to send forces into difficult territory remains plausible within the wider realities of imperial expansion. Persian armies operated across enormous distances. They had to secure borders, suppress resistance, protect trade routes, and demonstrate authority. The Western Desert presented challenges precisely because Persian control over Egypt depended heavily upon the Nile Valley. Remote oases could function as independent centers of influence, linking communities across the desert and potentially providing routes beyond the king's immediate reach. A campaign against an oasis might therefore have had a strategic purpose that later observers failed to understand. Perhaps the objective was not simply conquest. Perhaps it was punishment, reconnaissance, intimidation, or the securing of a route. And perhaps the army's disappearance was connected to local resistance rather than nature alone. If so, the most famous image, the soldiers standing helplessly beneath a wall of sand, might be only one piece of a much darker story. Imagine, then, another possibility. The army enters the desert and discovers that the landscape is not empty. Somewhere ahead, people who know every spring and hidden valley are watching them. They understand that the Persian soldiers depend upon water. They understand that the army cannot move freely without guides. They understand that distance itself can become a weapon. An enemy does not always need to meet an army in open battle. Wells can be concealed. Routes can be misdirected. Supply animals can be attacked. A column can be divided. A guide can disappear. In such circumstances, the desert becomes an ally of the smaller force. The invaders may march for days without seeing an enemy, while slowly becoming weaker. Every mile increases their dependence upon the very landscape their opponents understand better. Eventually, the army may be forced into a place where survival depends upon a single source of water. If that source is inaccessible, contaminated, or unexpectedly absent, an entire military expedition can collapse without one spectacular battle. This is why the legend of the sandstorm may be misleading if taken too literally. The soldiers may not have been swallowed in a single afternoon. Their disappearance may have unfolded over days or weeks through thirst, confusion, attack, starvation, and failed attempts to retreat. The final storm, if it occurred, could have erased the last physical traces of an army that was already collapsing. A natural disaster and human resistance may not be competing explanations. They may have been parts of the same catastrophe. Yet the most haunting possibility is that the desert did not need to destroy the army completely. It only needed to destroy its ability to return. A few survivors could have escaped. They might have wandered for days, separated from the main force, eventually reaching distant settlements or joining other caravans. But if those survivors were few, frightened, and ashamed of what had happened, their accounts might never have reached the Persian court. They could have disappeared into other communities, carrying memories that died with them. In that case, history would preserve only the outline. An army left, an army never returned, and a story emerged to explain the silence. Perhaps the number 50,000 was never an exact count. Perhaps it was simply a traditional expression for an enormous force. Perhaps the men who vanished were not all killed. Some may have been captured. Some may have joined local populations. Some may have died gradually, their bodies scattered across an area far too vast for archaeologists to recognize them as a single group. And perhaps, beneath one of those silent dunes, there is still a piece of their world waiting to be discovered. The broken edge of a shield, a bronze buckle, a weapon bearing the unmistakable style of Achaemenid Persia. Such a discovery would not merely solve an archaeological puzzle. It would give a physical voice to men who have been silent for 25 centuries. For now, however, the desert keeps its silence. The sands around the western oases continue to shift beneath the stars, just as they did when Cambyses' soldiers first entered this ancient wilderness. Modern roads and aircraft have made the region easier to cross, but they have not made it easier to understand. From above, the desert appears almost peaceful. Ridges form long shadows. Dry valleys resemble rivers frozen in stone. Old caravan paths appear and disappear across the surface. At night, the absence of artificial light creates a darkness deeper than anything the soldiers of Cambyses could have imagined. Beneath that darkness are layers of time, Stone Age camps, pharaonic settlements, Greek travelers, Roman caravans, Islamic routes. And somewhere within those layers, perhaps, the remains of a Persian expedition. The story has survived because it touches something older than archaeology, the fear of disappearing without a trace. An army represents organization, power, memory, and civilization. It carries banners so that people can see where it belongs. It carries weapons so that others know its strength. It carries written orders so that its purpose can be remembered. Yet all those symbols become meaningless when the road disappears. The lost soldiers entered the desert believing they were traveling through territory that could be measured and controlled. Instead, they entered a place where distance had no mercy, where wind could erase footprints within minutes, and where the horizon could remain unchanged for an entire lifetime. Their story had not ended. It had only become hidden. And somewhere ahead, beyond the dunes we can see, lies the question that has haunted every search ever since. If the desert swallowed them, what exactly did it swallow? Perhaps the strangest thing about the lost army of Cambyses is that the desert does not look like a place where history could disappear. It is so vast, so exposed, so seemingly empty that one might expect every trace of the past to remain visible. But the opposite is true. The Sahara is an archive without shelves, a library whose pages are constantly being rearranged. Wind moves the sand from one ridge to another. Rare rains carve temporary channels through ancient ground. Stones are broken, buried, exposed, and buried again. A footprint can survive for a few breaths, while a bronze object may remain hidden for thousands of years. Somewhere beneath that moving surface, the soldiers of Cambyses may still exist only as scattered fragments of a journey. Not an army anymore, not even a recognizable group of men, but traces separated by centuries of movement. A piece of metal may rest several kilometers from where it was dropped. A fragment of pottery may have been carried by another traveler. Bones may have been exposed and covered repeatedly. The desert does not preserve a story in the way a monument does. It preserves pieces, and it is left to later generations to wonder whether those pieces once belonged together. Perhaps this is why the mystery feels strangely peaceful when viewed from a distance. The men who marched beneath the Persian banners are no longer rushing toward a destination. Their journey has ended. The empire that sent them has vanished. The king who ordered the expedition is gone. Even the names of many soldiers were forgotten before their children were old. Only the landscape remains, turning slowly beneath the stars. And perhaps that is the true lesson hidden inside the old account of Cambyses. It is easy to imagine ancient empires as enormous and permanent things. Their kings built palaces, raised armies, conquered cities, carved inscriptions into stone, and placed their names upon monuments intended to survive forever. The Persian Empire was one of the greatest political structures of the ancient world. Its roads connected distant provinces. Its messengers carried commands across extraordinary distances. Its armies crossed mountains and rivers. Yet an empire can be enormous and still remain fragile at its edges. A king can command thousands of soldiers, but he cannot command the weather. He can order a road to be followed, but he cannot order the horizon to remain visible. He can conquer a kingdom, but he cannot make a desert reveal where its water lies. Cambyses may have believed that the Western Desert was simply another territory to be crossed. Perhaps his generals believed the same, but the desert obeyed none of them. It had existed before the Persian kings and would continue existing after their dynasty disappeared. The dunes did not recognize imperial borders. They did not remember victories or defeats. They simply moved. Slowly, patiently, almost invisibly. And tonight, if we imagine those soldiers once more, we need not imagine them as figures of horror. We can imagine them simply as travelers who had gone farther than they intended, carrying the ordinary hopes of people who believed there would always be another sunrise, another well, another road leading home. There is something deeply human in that final image. Before they became a legend, these were men who had names. They had families waiting somewhere beyond the desert. They had companions who knew the sound of their voices. They had carried objects that meant something to them. A knife, a belt, a small ornament, perhaps a letter or token from home. They had eaten meals, laughed, complained about the heat, repaired sandals, tended animals, and watched the sky change color at the end of each day. History remembers armies as numbers because numbers are easier to record. 50,000, 10,000, 1,000. But no army is truly a number. It is made of individual lives. And if the traditional account is even partly true, then thousands of individual stories ended somewhere beneath the western sands. We will never know most of their names. We will never know who was frightened first, who remained calm, who tried to organize the others, who searched for water, or who looked back toward the last visible ridge and realized that the road home had disappeared. We cannot reconstruct those final moments with certainty, and perhaps we should not try too hard. Some mysteries are made smaller by excessive certainty. It may be enough to imagine the soldiers as they once were. Tired travelers beneath an enormous sky, moving slowly through a world of gold and shadow, believing that somewhere ahead there was water. Now imagine the desert after they are gone. The storm has passed. The air becomes clear again. The last grains of sand settle into the hollows between the dunes. The sky darkens from gold to violet, from violet to deep blue. One by one, stars appear above the silent landscape. There is no army now, No shouting officers, no frightened animals, no marching feet. Only the wind moving gently over the surface. Perhaps a bronze spear point lies somewhere beneath the sand. Perhaps a shield is buried in a shallow depression. Perhaps nothing remains where the soldiers once stood. And yet the desert seems to remember them, not consciously, not as a living mind remembers, but through the layers of earth itself. Every dune contains fragments of journeys. Every ancient route carries traces of footsteps that no longer have names. The soldiers disappeared, but the place where they disappeared continued to exist. Seasons passed over it. Stars returned night after night. The moon crossed the same sky that had once watched their march. Long after Persian kings were forgotten, caravans continued moving across the desert. Long after those caravans disappeared, archaeologists began searching the same landscape with maps and instruments. And still, the answer remained just beyond reach. Perhaps the lost army is waiting beneath a dune that has not yet moved. Perhaps the evidence has already been found but not recognized. Or perhaps the story itself is the only surviving monument to those men. So let the mystery remain there for a while, beneath the quiet stars. There is no need to force the desert to speak. The story has traveled far enough. From Cambyses to Herodotus, from ancient travelers to modern archaeologists, the same unanswered question has crossed more than 2,000 years. Where did the lost army go? Perhaps they were buried by a catastrophic storm. Perhaps they were scattered by thirst and confusion. Perhaps local enemies defeated them. Perhaps the expedition took a different route altogether. Perhaps several smaller disasters eventually became one great legend. We may never know. And in the darkness of the desert, uncertainty can feel almost like rest. The soldiers no longer have anywhere they need to reach. The king no longer waits for their return. The guides no longer search for the next landmark. The road has ended. The horizon has become still. Imagine the sand beneath them becoming cool as night deepens. Imagine the heat leaving the stones. Imagine the wind becoming softer. The ancient cities have gone dark, has fallen silent. The ancient cities have gone dark. Even the memory of Cambyses has faded into the distant centuries. What remains is the slow breathing of the desert, rising and falling with the wind, as though the land itself were sleeping. And perhaps, for a moment, we can sleep with it. The moon continues its quiet journey over the dunes, just as it did on the night when the lost soldiers first disappeared from the written record. Somewhere far away, the Nile continues to flow toward the sea. Ancient temples stand beneath modern skies. Roads cross lands where caravans once walked. Cities glow where deserts once seemed endless. Time has carried the world forward, but the western sands remain. And if you imagine yourself standing there now, far from every light, you might notice how small the human world becomes. The horizon stretches in every direction. There is nothing demanding your attention, nothing to solve, nothing to fear. Only distance, only darkness, only the slow movement of wind over sand. Perhaps beneath your feet lies a fragment from a journey that began 25 centuries ago. Perhaps it does not. The mystery no longer needs an answer tonight. Let it remain hidden. Let the dunes keep their ancient secret. The lost army does not need to march anymore. Cambyses does not need to call them back. The guides no longer need to find the road. The desert has taken the footsteps, the banners, the voices, and finally the story itself, folding each one gently into the centuries. And as the stars grow brighter above the sleeping Sahara, The last traces of the ancient road disappear into darkness. The empire fades. The soldiers fade. The names fade. Even the question fades. Only the endless desert remains, breathing softly beneath the moon. And now, there is nothing left to follow. No final clue waits beyond the next dune. No distant army appears on the horizon. No ancient voice calls from the darkness. The story has reached the place where history becomes silence. Let the desert remain vast and empty. Let the wind smooth every footprint. Let the night settle over the dunes, slowly, patiently, without urgency. The men who once crossed this landscape have been resting there for longer than any living memory can reach. Their world has become dust. Their empire has become archaeology, and their journey has become a question passed quietly from one generation to another. Perhaps that is enough. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved completely. Some are meant to remain like distant stars, visible, beautiful, and impossibly far away. So let the lost army remain beneath the sands, not as a nightmare, but as a final image of stillness. The desert is quiet. The sky is endless. The dunes rise and fall like slow waves beneath the moon. And somewhere in that immense silence, the last footsteps of Cambiese's soldiers have finally stopped. Nothing is moving now. Nothing needs to move. The ancient road is empty. The horizon is dark. The night is deep. And the desert, which once swallowed an army, now holds it gently in the silence of time.